In this paper, I wish to offer a preliminary assessment of the geography and chronology of the clandestine book trade based on a metadata analysis of Parisian customs confiscation records from the years between 1769 and 1789. That metadata concerns the people and places attached to consignments of books confiscated by the Paris customs. In interpreting this data, it should be remembered that the French book trade was tightly controlled at every point. Even moving wholesale quantities of books around Paris was the monopoly of 30 licensed gardeniers, whilst bulky consignments of books were inspected repeatedly on their journeys across France. Bulk smuggling, as Mark Curran has shown recently, was very costly and a difficult enterprise, and only very rarely attempted by desperate book dealers. Wholesale consignments of books had generally to move through the established channels. We're not the first to study the confiscation registers. They were the centerpiece of Robert Dawson's Svec study, Confiscations at Customs, and were used by Robert Darnton to compile his corpus of clandestine literature in France. Yet opening the records to digital analysis allows us to take a more holistic view of these complex records and to see close-up patterns which were not previously visible. This is apparent even from the metadata we have already gathered. This metadata gives the places of origin of consignments of books, the people they belong to, and the agents who signed for them. This data had to be collated and consolidated by identifying which references belong to which individuals, and as far as possible, matching names to individuals through authority files and other records. Across 2,161 consignments, the data mentions several thousand people, including almost 2,000 names we had not previously encountered in other data sources that had already been entered into the French book trade in Enlightenment Europe, or FUBTI, databases. This work then has been a Herculean labour of love across a much longer period of time than we had originally envisaged. We're still in the process of gathering data on the reasons the books were detained and the authorities' final decisions concerning what was to be done with each of the titles we have now identified. Nevertheless, we can already draw some significant conclusions from the consignment metadata. This work is part of the Australian Research Council project, Mapping Print, Charting Enlightenment, which in turn is the latest stage of the FUBTI project. The confiscation records are the final data set for this project, and when complete will be cross-referenceable against several other record types, including the illegal works purchased and sold around Europe by the celebrated Société Typographique de Neuchâtel, whether pirate editions or highly clandestine libertine works. These were captured in the original FUBTI database, along with all the other books traded by the STN, and published in 2012. The STN records themselves have been extensively studied, above all by Robert Darnton, who used booksellers' orders in the STN records, but not records of the actual purchases and sales that were completed, to compile his lists of illegal bestsellers. But there are also case studies extant for many towns and regions that have been conducted by other scholars through the STN archive. Secondly, there are records of counterfeit editions, piracies that were legalized by the estampillage exercise of 1777 to 1781. These survive in Paris in the archives of the Chambre syndicale for 8 of France's 20 Chambre syndicale districts. These records have been used by François Furet and his team for the Livre Society volumes and by Anne Bose and Robert Dawson, but they still have secrets to reveal, I think. The print run records for books licensed between 1777 and 1789 form our third data set. These books are published under the Permission Simple license, which aim to end or at least significantly reduce piracy. These records too have been studied by Dawson, who produced an annotated listing, which we've compared to the original documents. But digital analysis allows for far more complex readings and comparisons with other sources. Fourthly, we have the inventory of the Busty's secret depot, again published by Robert Dawson, but the original of which is now lost. And that records confiscated books found in the Bastille following its capture by revolutionary crowds in July 1789. Digital analysis and cross-referencing of all of these sources opens new research possibilities and extends the work Mark Curran and I conducted on the STN records between 2007 and 2012, as outlined in our twin volumes, Selling Enlightenment and Enlightenment Bestsellers. These studies overturn much accepted wisdom concerning the STN, the international book trade, and the role of print culture in the Enlightenment. Of particular relevance to the current analysis is my chapter on the anatomy of the illegal book trade. It argued that two government measures, the decrees of the 30th of August 1777 and the 12th of June 1783, seem to have significantly undermined the STN's commerce in illegal works. The August 1777 decree set up a more effective inspection regime, attaching centrally appointed inspectors to each chambre syndicale to oversee the examination of consignments of important works. This gave the inspection regime teeth. Many booksellers wrote in the wake of the decree to the STN, informing them that they no longer dared accept clandestine wares. This measure impacted the STN's clandestine and pornographic trades even more seriously than its counterfeit trade. The coup de grace for the pirate trade, however, came with the 1783 decree, which ordered all imported books to be sent to Paris for inspection, rather than to the local chambre syndicale closest to the consignment's intended destination. This increased transport costs and time lags, particularly for books arriving from Switzerland and Avignon. Moreover, the illegal sector was differently structured to what existing work, which is concentrated on prohibited works, might lead us to expect. I concur with Roger Chartier, Daniel Roche, and Robert Darnton that the illegal sector of the book trade, to use the latter's priapic epithets, was vast, enormous, huge, and perhaps comprised half of the trade. However, this estimate is not very helpful, since illegality was a capacious, possibly capricious, and certainly imprecise category. It embraced the highly clandestine libertine sector, unlicensed pirate editions of harmless privileged works, nouveautés which had not passed through the formal permissions mechanism, and Protestant religious works, including translations of that perennial subversive work, the Bible. There was also a quasi-legal sector comprising works published under permission tacite, a strange legal subterfuge whereby the government agreed to allow a work to circulate without formal license or the imprimatur of official approval, provided it appeared under a false, usually foreign imprint. Tacite editions therefore had many of the traits of clandestinity, particularly as permission tacites might be withdrawn at any time. As the confiscation registers show, books were quite frequently rayés de la registre des permissions tacites. Given this complexity, I attempted to quantify as best I could the various parts of the illegal sector, as you can see in the graph. I began by cross-referencing two different listings of clandestine prohibited works, confiscated books found in the Bastille, and Darnton's corpus of clandestine literature. By comparing the overlap between datasets, calculating the missing quadrant of unknown unknowns, the clandestine titles that were missing from both datasets, and discovering the average number of editions for sample books in each quadrant, I arrived at a best estimate of clandestine editions. Multiplied by 1,000, a crude standard multiplier used by book historians, I arrived at an estimate also for the number of copies of clandestine French language works produced across the era 1769 to 1789. Further calculations totaled copies produced under the Permission Sampler license and compared them with surviving library holdings to derive a ratio of extant licensed to unlicensed editions from the period 1778 to 1789. This empowered an approximation for the output of all works for which licenses were available. Comparison to the Permission Sampler statistics with the records for pirate works legalized during the estampillage exercise gave further indicators. First, it suggested the production of titles made available under the Permission Simple license could be projected backwards into the years before the Acts of 30th August 1777. Second, it allowed me to estimate the scale of piratical reproduction of works not covered by the Permission Simple. These constituted approximately half of all works legalized in the estampillage exercise. Finally, we have full records of the editions made available under the Permission Tacite licenses, so we can estimate production under those licenses. The pie chart on the screen is the result of this number crunching, which is further detailed in my online appendices. This representation, however, still doesn't include editions of any work that was made available under Permission Tacites, but for which permission for the particular edition was never sought, and nor does it include nouveautés, new works published that the regime hadn't seen before and didn't think it had licensed. Analysis of our new metadata confirms and adds texture to some of these preliminary points. This becomes evident when we map the origins of consignments confiscated at Paris Customs, as on this map. The dots on the map are scaled to show the number of consignments coming from each place. For consignments originating abroad, the place recorded is not the ultimate place of origin, but rather the registers recorded, though not invariably, where the consignments entered the French postal system. And for foreign works, this was usually a frontier post en route to their destination. The headline news from this map is that current understandings of the geography of the book trade may be inadequate. Note in particular the high volume of confiscations originating in the interior of France. Lyon and Rouen were the major centres of this production. That's no surprise for anyone who knows the book trade, because they were the second and third largest centres. But our initial hypothesis is that these will prove to be mainly pirated works and nouveautés rather than highly clandestine ones. Secondly, the Swiss role in the illegal book market appears smaller than its prominence in previous scholarship might suggest. However, this may in part reflect the fact that in comparison to books produced in Britain, Belgium, or the Netherlands, relatively few Swiss books entering the kingdom would have been inspected at Paris prior to 1783, because they were sent to other destinations closer to their destination. As we shall see, further interrogation of the data seems to bear this out. Thirdly, Robert Darnton's assertions that there were a string of publishing houses producing clandestine and pirated books operating along the entire Rhine frontier from Switzerland to the Channel needs a certain modification. In particular, very few confiscations originated in the German-speaking lands. This is a finding that would appear to lend support to Mark Curran's suggestion that we should talk of distinctive northern and southern markets. Fourthly, relatively few books seem also to have come from Britain, to judge from the size of the circles for Boulogne-sur-Mer, Calais, Caen, and Dunkirk. Although, until we have further data, it remains possible that British books also arrived en nombre, in the parlance of the trade, via river as far as Rouen. Instead, it appears that most consignments of illegal books from abroad came from the Low Countries via border crossings at Charleville-Mézières, then two separate towns and treated as such in the records, from Valenciennes, Sedan, or the nearby frontier post of Tourcy. However, this trade from or via Belgium includes a disproportionately large number of confiscations of a handful of influential periodicals, notably Langues Annales, which was produced in Brussels for part of its history, and Pierre Rousseau's Journal Encyclopédique, both of which were regularly seized. Between 1771 and 1783, almost 1/3 of confiscated consignments coming from Tourcy was sent to Luton, who handled the distribution of several periodicals in Paris and across the kingdom. In all, these amounted to 37 of 113 seizures coming via that route. A handful more confiscations were seized en route to the press baron, Charles-Joseph Panckoucke. Chronological breakdowns linking confiscated consignments with their places of origin indicate, moreover, some striking trends. Although this could be shown via maps, the point can be made more strikingly by more abstract forms of visualization, as shown in the next slide. This slide, and the two that follow it, divide the 18-year period covered by the confiscation registers into three roughly equal blocks of 6 years, punctuated by the decrees of the 30th of August 1777 and the 12th of June 1783. The figure in each arrow represents the number of confiscations coming from a particular region, as described in the balloons on the left-hand column, while start and end dates for the three periods are marked by the blue boxes and dividing lines. The attentive might note here that the dates of division are not precisely those of the decrees that I mentioned. And the reason for that is that I've left a month to allow for the effects of the decrees to filter through to book traders and to affect their behaviours. By breaking down the figures in this way, we can see that the number of confiscated consignments originating in the Suisse romande, those in the orange and yellow lines on the table, collapsed to almost nothing after the 30th of August 1777 decrees. As you can see, those coming from Nyon, Lausanne and Geneva via the licensed entry points for those cities of La Cure, Morez and Les Russes dropped from 42 consignments in the first 6-year period to just 1. For Neuchâtel, via Le Frambourg and Pontarlier, the numbers are smaller at just 9, from 9 down to 3. But the overall pattern here is inescapable. From 51 consignments in the earlier period, the number falls by over 90% for the second period. The conclusion then is unmistakable. The 1777 decrees clearly disrupted the Swiss trade, as the STN data had suggested. The number of confiscations picks up, however, when we get to 1783. But this is because from that date, books sent from Switzerland to anywhere in France, and not just to the region administered by the Parisian Chambre syndicale, had to go via Paris. After July 1783, confiscations from Switzerland were almost certainly predominantly destined for clients in southeastern France, who still saved time at least by ordering books from wholesalers in the Swiss romande. The divergent figures for books from Bern and Basel are a little bit misleading. The pattern there is dominated by imports of Swiss almanac, which continue to be sent annually regardless of legal changes. For example, the Diable Boiteux, published in Bern, was for several years ritually confiscated as a nouveauté each December. The apparent destruction of the Swiss trade after the 30th of August 1777 is mirrored in the top row of this second slide by a similar collapse in confiscations coming from another southern source, which is to say the papal enclave of Avignon. The drop there of 95% in the number of confiscations is almost total, and in this case remained permanent. The Avignon trade was clearly even worse and more permanently hit than the Swiss. The pattern of decline for books entering from the Low Countries, the second row of this graph, or the Channel ports, the third row, tells a rather different story. Here there appears to have been a sharp decline in confiscations after 1777 as suppliers reduced their exposure to risk, followed by a further decline, perhaps related to the cost of sending all books via Paris, after 1783. Books from these areas would of course have been much more likely than Swiss books to be going to Paris before 1777 due to proximity. There is, however, an apparent anomaly with the Belgian statistics. Confiscations coming from Valenciennes buck the trend evident in other Belgian frontier towns, as shown here on the first row. The explanation for this is partly geographic. Valenciennes was the closest of the entry points to Paris on the route from Brussels. So after 1783, books from Brussels and indeed Amsterdam that would once have been inspected in Lille or Amiens or other provincial chambres syndicales now had to go to Paris and were thus rerouted via Valenciennes. But why was there a rise after 1777? My acting hypothesis here is it was primarily due to local circumstances, principally the relocation of the arch anti-philosophe Simon Nicolas Henri Linguet from London to Brussels in 1778. His celebrated annals were confiscated several times prior to his being lured to Paris and arrested in 1780. Finally, we should note that there was a fall in the number of confiscations of books coming from the major French provincial centres after the 1777 decrees. My acting hypothesis, until we've gained more data, this was probably due to a decline in domestic counterfeiting following the estampillage exercise, introduction of the Permission Simple license, and establishment of a more rigorous inspection apparatus in the provinces. In contrast, the provincial centres of Lyon and Rouen seem to have been little impacted by the 1783 decree because, presumably, they were not centres of libertine book production. It's already clear then from the confiscation metadate that the decrees of August 1777 and June 1783 had real bite, but differentially on the French book trade of the various French and European regions from which France derived its books. Clearly, they were to a large degree successful in crushing the clandestine trade and excluding foreign books. It also appeared that they were effective in their mercantilist aim of excluding foreign publishers from the French market, though to establish this claim we would need to look more closely at the provenance of all book consignments as recorded in the French customs registers, rather than focusing exclusively on those that were confiscated. When we have systematic data on the actual titles confiscated, the reasons for their confiscations, and the final judgment of the regime on the books they seized, we will be able to add further nuance and detail to these preliminary findings. Indeed, the power of our analysis and the questions we can ask will be exponentially increased. What is already evident, however, is that far from succumbing in its final years to a torrent of foreign-produced clandestine literature, the French government was, in the decade prior to the pre-revolutionary crisis, extending its control over the book trade and improving its policing apparatus, while simultaneously achieving its mercantilist and diplomatic goals by establishing a chokehold over the extraterritorial publishers of French literature. Calls for the liberalisation of publishing and for freedom of the press in 1789 need to be seen in this context. Thank you.